Wow, this is so nice. Oh, this is Zarina's house.
Hey, what are you doing here? You are trespassing my place.
Huh? What is trespass?
In a highly publicized incident, a social media influencer, Nurul and Ariani had entered the private residence of a Malaysian actress, Zarina Anjoulie, without her permission. The act was allegedly recorded and circulated online. The intrusion was not invited, nor did the defendant have any legal right to be present on the premises. So the plaintiff, who was in the possession of the property, had viewed the defendant's entry as a clear violation of her right to exclusive possession of her land. Now, let's break down the cause of action, which is the foundation of this entire legal claim, which in this case, the plaintiff, Zarina Anjoulie, is suing the defendant, Nurul Ariani based on the tort of trespass to land. The trespass to land happens when someone intentionally enters a land that is in the possession of another, without permission and without any lawful excuse. So it doesn't matter whether they stayed for 5 seconds or even 5 hours, and it doesn't matter if they didn't cause any physical harm onto anyone. If someone steps onto a land that they have no right to enter, the law will recognize it as an invasion of rights. This tort is classified as a strict liability tort, which means that the plaintiff does not have to prove that there is any actual harm that was caused, and the mere act of intrusion is enough to give rise to legal consequences. So the law will prioritize the protection of possession and not just ownership. So even a tenant or even an occupier, someone who does not own the land but is lawfully in possession of it, is protected under this tort. This tort is So this is because the law takes the right to private property very seriously. It is one of the most fundamental rights that a person can have. Your home is your sanctuary, and the law will ensure that this sanctuary is protected from unwanted and unlawful interference, where no one, not even a celebrity, a government officer, nor even a mere social media influencer, has the right to step onto someone else's land without permission.
In one-sided cases of Mexico Industries Sdn Bhd and Lee Kum Foy and until 2023, the parties in dispute is between the plaintiff, which is the Mexico Industry, and the defendant, which is Lee Kum Foy and the other 3 defendants. Mexico Industries Sdn Bhd, the registered owner of a plot of land in Selangor, discovered unauthorized activities in his own land or in his own property in January 2015. And this included the construction of a road, installations of a zinc fence, placement of the sand mining machinery, and a signboard that falsely claimed the collaboration between them and also the state Selangor government under the name of Sri Gumut Enterprise. Mexico's general manager confronted these individuals at the site, including the second defendant. And despite the warning that have been given, the trespass still continued, prompting Mexico to lodge police reports and initiate criminal charges under Section 379 for theft and 447 for criminal trespass under the Penal Code. In 2017, Mexico filed a current suit against all of the defendants seeking damages for the trespass. And the second defendant admitted to enter the land but argued that he relied on the first third party's representations about the government's approvals. And the first third party, in return, denied the involvement and raised the principle of res judicata. The court successfully identified a few legal issues, but in this matter, we will only be focusing on the trespass to land. So the core legal issues here is whether the defendant committed trespass to land under the Malaysian law. The court rejected the second defendant's defense of relying on the first third party's assurances by emphasizing that his failure to verify the land ownership through a simple land search. But from this case, the legal principle that can be extracted is that trespass to land is a strict liability requiring no proof of harm, and the parties entering the land must be independently verify the ownership and permissions. And in this case, reliance on third-party assurances without due diligence is legally insufficient to avoid liability, and inconsistent of evidence can shift liability to third parties. And now, to apply it in the situations of Nurul and Zarina, under the Malaysian law, trespass to land occurs when an individual enters or remains on another person's property without lawful justifications, and Zarina, as a lawful occupant or owner of the residence, hold an exclusive right of the possessions of the premises, and Nurul's entry into Zarina's home without permissions constitutes trespassing, even if she believed that her actions were harmless or just for a social media content. Crucially, no proof of damage, like property destructions, is required. Unauthorized entry alone already suffices to establish the liability, and this is consistent with the case of Metrico, which established that physical entry and actions such as sand mining were already enough to prove trespassing, regardless of whether the defendant is intended or not to trespass. And Zarina is entitled to remedies such as damages or injunctive relief, while Nurul will raise both civil and criminal consequences. And this reaffirms that property rights are sacrosanct and individuals must verify permissions before entering someone else's private premises. Another decided case of Antic and Carrington, 1765, on November. The defendant and 3 others acting under a warrant issued by the British Secretary of State forcibly entered the home of the plaintiff, and the warrant authorized them to search for written and printed materials allegedly containing seditious words against the government. And the defendants broke open boxes, chests, and drawers, searched every room for about 4 hours, and seized a large quantity of plaintiff's paper. Plaintiff was taken to the Secretary of State along with the seized materials, and he then sued for trespass, arguing that the entry and the seizure were unlawful because the warrant was invalid. And the court ruled in favor of Antic, holding that Carrington and his associates committed trespassing, and the warrant was invalid, so the defendants had no right to enter or seize Antic's property. And Antic was also entitled to damages for the trespass. Discussing the legal principle, the court held that the state is subject to the same laws of trespass as any individuals. Without the property owner's consent or a valid legal authority, entry onto a private property is considered unlawful. The warrant issued by the Secretary of State was invalid because only a justice of the peace could issue such warrants, and the Secretary of State was not a justice of the peace, and therefore the defendants had no lawful authority to enter or search Antic's property. And the case established the constitutional principle that government officials cannot exercise public power unless expressly authorized by the law. And the Lord Camden famously stated that every invasion of the private property is a trespass unless it is justified by law, and if no legal justifications exist, the plaintiff must succeed. Like in our situations, we can see that the way Nurul entered Zarina private residence without permissions or lawful authority, which is a direct and immediate interference with Zarina's exclusive possessions of her own land. Under the Malaysian law, trespass to land occurs when a person intentionally enters or remains on someone's or another person's property without consent or legal justifications. And the fact that the intrusion was recorded and also circulated online further evidences the deliberate nature of the entry. And the principle from Antic and Carrington establishes that the government's officials or any individuals cannot lawfully enter private property without explicit legal authority or consent. And by extending this legal principle, any unauthorized entry by a private individual, such as Nurul, similarly constitutes to trespass. And as quoted from Antic and Carrington, the state or private persons alike are bound by the law, and protecting private property and exclusive possession.
From
the news article, there are three parties that could be identified, which are the defendant, the victim, and also the public prosecutor. Nurul Ariani Muhammad Zahar, a 41 years old Malaysian social media influencer. She is the one charged with criminal trespass. Her actions, which included unlawfully entering a private residence, became the basis of the charge under Section 447 of the Penal Code. Second, the victim, named Zarina Anjoulie, a well-known actress and public figure in Malaysia. The trespass occurred at her home in Kampung Chelet Nilai, and she is not involved in the prosecution directly, but her residence is the subject of the offence. As the rightful possessor of the property, her rights were violated by the defendant's unlawful entry. And third, the last one, the prosecution, which is the public prosecutor. She is representing the state in upholding the law. In criminal cases such as this one, the state has the burden to prove that an offence has occurred under the law. In this instance, the offence of criminal trespass. So, here is the statement of the fact. On May 7, 2025, a social media influencer named Nurul Ariani Muhammad Zahar allegedly entered the home of local actress Zarina Anjoulie in Kampung Chelet Nilai without permission. The incident, which was widely discussed online, raised serious concern about privacy and personal boundaries, especially involving public figures. Nurul was later charged in court under Section 447 of the Penal Code for trespassing. During the court mentioned on May 19, she pleaded guilty and the case was scheduled for sentencing on June 19. The matter has drawn public attention due to the clash between social media behavior and legal rights to private property.
The central legal issue in this case is whether the defendant's unauthorized and intentional entry onto the plaintiff's land without consent or lawful justification constitutes a trespass to land under the thought of law. So at first, it might sound like a yes or no question, but in legal analysis, this issue ties directly into the core of property rights. It examines whether the entry alone is enough to trigger legal responsibility, and in the case of trespass, it absolutely is. In claims like this, the law does not care whether the entry was for 5 minutes or even 5 hours. It doesn't ask whether the defendant meant to offend, or the only question is, did the person enter the land possessed by another without consent or legal right? And in this case, the answer is unequivocal. Nurul Ariani had no invitation and no legal basis and no emergency or special circumstance that might excuse her conduct. Her entry was intentional, unauthorized, and publicly disseminated, which likely intensified the emotional and reputational harm experienced by Zarina. Even if Nurul had believed wrongly that she had some right to be there, the belief would not change the legal outcome. As clarified in the case of League Against Cruel Sports, the court only cares that the act of entry was voluntary. A person is liable even if they mistakenly thought the entry was lawful. So, in summary, the cause of action, trespass to land, is firmly grounded in established legal precedent and principles. It exists to protect people from unwanted physical intrusion into their private property. So the legal issue whether Nurul's conduct qualifies as trespass is answered clearly by the facts. There was an intentional act of entry, no consent, and no justification. And the recording and public sharing of the incident further aggravate the wrong. This is a classic case of trespass, and not just on paper, but also in reality. It demonstrates how the law acts to protect the sanctity of private spaces and uphold the dignity of individuals in the face of public intrusion.
Let's move on to the judgment. Based on the available evidence, it is clear on a balance of probabilities that the defendant, Nurul Ariani Muhammad Zahar, entered the residential premises lawfully occupied by the plaintiff, which is Zarina Anjoulie, without consent or lawful authority. The law of tort protects individuals' right to exclusive possession of their land, and any intentional and authorized entry onto another's land and amounts to trespass regardless of whether actual damage occurs. Here, the defendant's uninvited presence on the property constitutes a trespass to land. Her actions interfere with the plaintiff's right to enjoy and possess her property without intrusion. No valid defense has been established to justify the defendant's entry. The conduct was deliberate and cannot be excused. Therefore, the following outcomes are appropriate. First, general damages for the infringement of the plaintiff's possessory rights. Second, aggravated damages to reflect the emotional distress caused by the defendant's deliberate and intrusive behavior. And also, an injunction to restrain the defendant from entering the plaintiff's property in the future.
The ratio decidendi behind the court's judgment relies on this, where the tort of a trespass is committed where a person intentionally enters land into the possessions of another without consent, regardless of their motive or the actual harm. And on top of that, it is not necessary to prove the damage, only that the entry occurred without the lawful justification. This is a strict liability tort designed to protect possessions and the property rights.
In this case, the parties involved are the plaintiff, which is Zarina Anjoulie, which is the lawful possessor of residential premises in Nilai Negeri Sembilan, and the defendant, which is Nurul Ariani Muhammad Zahar, who is a social media influencer who unlawfully entered the plaintiff property without consent. This incident has sparked public attention due to its legal and social implication, especially in this digital era where private boundaries are often crossed for viral content. In this section also, we will go through the commentaries and opinion, there are two legal issues in this case. The first one is whether Zarina Anjoulie had lawful possession of the land at the time of the defendant entered, and the second one is whether Nurul Ariani committed trespass to land by entering the plaintiff property without any consent or legal justification. The first issue is whether Zarina Anjoulie had lawful possession of the land at the time Nurul Ariani entered. In tort law, particularly trespass to land, the right to sue arises from possession and not from the ownership. Lawful possession can be in fact or in law. A person with control over the land and the ability to exclude others can claim for this trespass. This can be referred to the case of Yip Shoshan and Marubeni, where the court ruled that a plaintiff who had taken physical possession was entitled to sue even if the trespass occurred shortly before registration. In addition, it also can be referred to the case of Seni and Hassan, where in this case, it was affirmed that actual possession, even without legal title, is sufficient against all but those with better legal rights. Zarina Anjoulie clearly had a physical possession of her home as she lived there, controlled it, and also exclude others. Her status as the occupier satisfies possession in fact, which is enough to sue for the trespass. There is no evidence that anyone had a superior right of possession than she did. In conclusion, Zarina Anjoulie had lawful possession of the premises. Therefore, she had the legal standing to initiate a claim for trespass to land. Next, the second legal issue is whether Nurul Ariani committed trespass to land by entering the plaintiff property without any consent or legal justification. Trespass to land requires two key elements. The first one is an intentional act, and the second one is interferes with possession. It is actionable per se, meaning the plaintiff doesn't need to prove damages. This can be referred to the case of Zulaika Bibi Amaidin, where the court held that once the defendant lost their right to remain, their continued occupation became trespass. Nurul entered Zarina's property on her own whim, without any form of consent or lawful excuse. Her entry was not under duress or mistaken belief. It was deliberate act, likely for content creation. This act fulfills all the elements of the trespass, which are intentional entry, interference with possession, and there was no legal justification. This also can be referred to the previous case that has been discussed before. In conclusion, Nurul Nur Ariani committed trespass to land by unlawful entering Zarina Anjouli's premises. Based on our legal analysis, both issues strongly support the plaintiff claim. Trespass law is designed to protect personal space and possession. The facts, when applied to the principle from the case of Seni and Hassan, Yip Shoshan, and also from the case of Zulaikha Bibi, it confirmed that Zarina was in lawful possession and Nurul's entry was unlawful and unjustified. This case really shows how, in today's digital world, the chase for online attention can sometimes lead to a serious real-life consequences. Just because someone is an influencer or public figure does not mean that they can ignore the law. At the end of the day, everyone's property and privacy deserve to be respected. The court's decision is a strong reminder that legal boundaries is still be applied even in the age of the social media.